All right, so if you made it through the Blender baking info video and some of the previous ones that talked about remeshing with voxel remesher, this is going to be where this all comes together. So basically, you start making a model, right? We're going to kind of fly through this. So it's not really beginner friendly necessarily, but you might be doing a Boolean in-gun workflow per se, right? And so let's just go ahead and start creating some things that you might end up creating in that workflow, something like a weapon. So we'll do the idea of a receiver anyways. So I'm going to create a cylinder, do this number. A lot of times, like AR uppers or whatever, they might be something like this anyways. We'll play around with that idea here in this video. All right, so we got this and we got this. Okay, good. Let's duplicate this, scale it, and we'll fly through the modeling real quick. This is for all intents and purposes. This is also going to be our low poly. Of course, there's, better ways of modeling perhaps where you're using non-destructive cylinders so you can change the vertex count for the cylinder. We're just going to kind of ignore that here and just work with a more or less unoptimized low poly. So here's what you need to do though. You need to start modeling this thing. So you'll do your Booleans, you'll start unioning things together, subtracting things. You might use box cutter, use the in-gun cutter. You might cut out some shapes for like Picatinny rails or whatever the case there. We'll just go ahead and mirror that, cut that out real quick. We'll go the other way with it now. And we might have something like that. We'll do a box cut. Select the object first. And we'll just do the idea of the rails. And we'll go ahead and pull those out. Something like so. Maybe you cut too far and or maybe you don't need the last one or something. I don't know. Maybe something didn't work out there. So you can always take your cutters and you can cut the cutters. When you do that, this one, nothing happens. Well, the reason why is you got to keep things in order too. So it reorders this automatically with hard ops. You need to change the orders around. Sometimes you can change the settings in hard ops and box cutter, and you can change the behaviors, whether things are going to order or not, whatever the case there. Okay. So yeah, we could basically go through this whole thing and just start dicing it up, cutting it up very quickly with these add-ons. It's helpful. The Bool Tools add-on might be useful. You can see it just undid my setup there. I don't know why, or actually I don't know which one I need to turn off. Probably the array sort, right? And that would be sort array there. Maybe that'll keep it from happening if that happens again. All right, so we're starting to work this kind of a mesh, and we might need to say trim the bottom here, maybe trim the back, trim the front. Okay, so we get something more like that. I don't really like that bottom cut, so let's go ahead and pull that down. I don't think we're going to get that to go out exactly where I need it to go. So I'm going to delete that, and we're going to go ahead and get rid of this Boolean that went dead in the list there. We're just going to pull that down and do this instead. That's all right. All right, so we have some shapes like this going on, which is great. This particular cylinder in the middle, I'm not too much of a fan of how big it is. We'll try to select it, and I'm going to scale it down. I won't move it. Let's pull it out there. All right, so let's do box cutter, and we go through and we start making additional cuts where needed. In this case, I want this to be somewhere inside here. Okay, so this is normally where the charging handle kind of goes in the impingement system. So we'll move that around, move it up on Y. We'll hit 1 to mirror it. We'll do that number, that's fine. Maybe we want to just do something really simple here, the idea of an ejection port. So we do this number. Shift click, go into edit mode, loop cut here, extrude out, and now you can see where that's going, right? So we're able to do things like this very fast, very efficient. And this one, we can also select these edges, and we can actually mark these with hard ops. So it's adding a bevel weight to it right here. So if we were to do a bevel, we can hit L and use bevel weights, hit C to clamp it, mouse wheel it up. Unfortunately, it doesn't add a weld to it. It should, but it doesn't. And we can hit weld, and that'll actually fix any little issues we have with that because we would have doubles. This edge here, we can change the bevel weight. We can turn it down if we wanted to. All right. So now our bevel's taking effect on this thing, and we want to make sure we're using possibly even segments or whatever the case. Or we can just use it non-destructively. It doesn't really matter. So we have the idea of a receiver starting, basically. We might need other elements like cylinders. We can use dot snapping up here, turning that on. So we might be able to snap to the front here in this area, and then push through, press G and X in this case. And we can kind of force that all the way through right there. Press E again, pull it out. There you go. So you can see we do that number, right? So that would be where the gas back goes, tube. All right, anyways, so I think we get the idea. This is the idea of a receiver. It's pretty simple, straightforward. You know, you can try shading auto smooth. A lot of the cutters, you got to shade auto smooth as well. So might hit, in this case, my collection, all of it's hidden. Alt H, bring it back. Select all, shade auto smooth, see if that helps any of that. Sometimes it does, sometimes it does not. Anyways, there we go. So this is going to be more or less your low poly. You wouldn't want to go through and optimize it, obviously, at some point, but you wouldn't do it right yet. You need these bevels to have a high enough resolution for these cylindrical shapes so that you can use a remesher. That's basically the idea here, is we're going to remesh this thing. And so for simplicity's sake, I'm going to go ahead and turn box cutter off before we make errors. We're going to snap absolute grid snap. So I'm going to take this base shape and Shift D to duplicate it, right click again, convert to a mesh, G and X, hold control, snap it out to the side. This will actually go on a grid with the origin point. This is kind of important because if we created a low poly later on out of this one, like we optimized it, we could go ahead and line it up to this one, which we're going to go ahead and we're going to remesh. So ideally, you would remesh using the modifiers. That's not always the case, though. I've talked about this in a video before. But basically, if you wanted to take something like this, go into sculpt mode, you can set face sets and initialize face sets by sharp edges if you had ran a sharp with hard ops. Or you could also try using binormals. It's two different options there. But usually, marking it sharp with hard ops, going into sculpt mode, you can do face sets by sharp edges, and you'll get something more like that. Okay, they're kind of all over the place. Sometimes that's good, sometimes it's bad. But it is something that you could do because you might take this and remesh this in sculpt mode even, and you'll set the resolution to whatever you need it to be by pressing R, hitting Control R, and remeshing, obviously like that. And this just offers you a little bit more control because you can use the mesh filter. You can set this to smooth, and you can smooth based off of the face set. So you can press H, and you can click and drag to the right. It's not going to do much if you just click and keep dragging. So click, drag to the right. You can type in values here, and you can start to smooth things like this out. If you're going with the sculpting destructive remesh method, right? But we're not going to be doing that. We're going to be taking this base, and we'll pull it back out. New version, or same version anyways. So we're going to be using the modifiers. The remesh modifiers, at least on my system, are very slow, but they're still very useful. And you could try using different ones here. You can use smooth, you can use sharp, you can use voxel. In case of sharp, you bump up the octree depth. A lot of times this one works out pretty well. And it tends to handle the edges better, I think. So click smooth shading, but you may also have to use voxel. Just keep that in mind. So smooth shading. Now we add smooth corrective modifier. It's smooth corrective modifier. Only smooth it. It's going to smooth the whole thing at the same time. And you can see where this is going to go. If I type in 25 here, it's going to smooth it like so. If you don't have enough resolution on these sections here, what ends up happening is that this doesn't really doesn't work out too well, basically. You see what's happening? So that's where you might want to try, if a last-ditch effort at least, to maybe use the sculpt mode version, but it would be better if this was non-destructive in a manner where you could adjust the cylindrical sides and all that, right? I made a video talking about making primitive shapes that you could do for that with geonodes. So check the playlist or the videos I've uploaded at least, and see if you can find the geonode primitives or video or whatever. All right, with all that out of the way, we can smooth this like a little bit more than we probably think we should. And that's just because it tends to look a little bit nicer when it's smoother for video games. And so like when you're looking at things from a little bit further away, it will still pick up the bevels on it, basically. If it's like a third-person weapon or something like that. First-person weapon, a lot of times you would want to keep these relatively sharp still because they occupy a lot of screen space. And, you know, if it's like this far away, we can see obviously it's blurry. So you do want to test it just by kind of laying out the view kind of the same way you would see it in a game engine. So here's the thing. It is remeshed. That's great. And we need to decimate it. Now, there's a couple tricks to this. I'm going to go ahead and destroy these, even though you don't have to, but it's just going to speed up the process here of what I'm doing. So I'm just going to convert it to a mesh. I need to decimate this at some point. You could use the decimate modifier, type in something like usually 0.2 to 0.4 works well. 0.1 sometimes works, but it gets a little bit sketchy the further you go down, basically. Because it was at like 1,000,000 triangles or whatever, and now it's going to decimate it down to, what, 254,000? Okay. It's going to look like this, right? Sometimes you can still get errors in here with this, so just to be aware of that. Like, it happens, you have to check for them, okay? That's what you're going to be looking for. But any kind of weird shading or whatever at this point, it'll show up in your normal map. If more than likely it would. So if you have like these rough edges, this will still more than likely show up in the normal. But if you're careful with it, it might not. So there's like a little bit of a leeway there, but it's a very tight margin basically. All right, it's well on the edges like this. So could decimate it that way. That's fine. But let's talk about something else real quick. This is a dense mesh, and it's pretty decent. So you could actually sculpt on this thing too if you wanted to. So at this point, you can actually use the scrape tool. You could use symmetry up here perhaps, and you can go through, you can do little edits on this thing if you want to add some edge wear and damages. In the case of these little voxel kind of errors here, you might be able to scrape them out. You can't smooth them out because they just get worse. But you might be able to scrape them out a little bit. So if you're doing like a hard surface shape that's made of metal or something like that, that might be useful to you, okay? On the flip side of this, though, you can also try using the actual smooth tool, turn it really low strength. You might be able to go through and correct some of this stuff just slightly, okay, if you're having issues with it. But there's a little trick to this. You don't want to really change the shape overall. You want to try to keep it as close to that low poly as possible. Not entirely true. You could do some, I've done it at least, like where you do quite a bit of sculpting that doesn't match that, and you could actually force the cage to like line up to it, but it's a little tricky to get that kind of going in an efficient manner. So with that out of the way, so you can sculpt on these things too, guys. No problem. Now, something else I want to mention, you could decimate it. Some guys are remeshing it. Okay, you can actually remesh this thing again using the voxel remesher. You can turn on smooth shading perhaps, and you can change the voxel size to something more dense. We'll see how this goes here, but then you turn this adaptivity on, and you'll see what happens here when we do this. Let's try 0.1 first and see what happens. You see? So you bump that voxel size down to whatever you need it to be, really. We'll do 0.01 in this case, and you'll see we shade it smooth. All right, and for the most part, it's not exactly as good as it could be, but maybe try like 0.01 and see what happens. All right, so it's getting a little bit more dense. Let's try 0.001. You want the edges to be more dense, basically. You can see where that's going. It's starting to work out. It's not too bad. You can keep going with that if you needed to. It might generate some errors sometimes in certain areas. You got to be careful with that. But you could potentially go through here, and if you see an error, I don't see any right now, you could apply the remesh basically, and you can actually go in and dissolve the errors or work the topology in those areas if you needed to. It's something to keep in mind, okay? But for all intents and purposes, this is your high poly, guys. So we can just call it the upper underscore high. And I'm going to go ahead and apply that. So you got two options, decimate or remesh to reduce it. This one's actually more efficient, by the way. I'm noticing that the face counts generally they go lower. But all right, so that's your high, guys, more or less. This one needs to be unwrapped. So we take the shape again, and this is where you would do your bevel reductions, and then you would duplicate it, right click, convert it to a mesh. We could pull it out to the side over here. We snap to the grid, so this will line back up with this one. I hit / to isolate it. This needs to be gone through very thoroughly and optimized and make sure everything's working correctly. We're not going to go through that in this video. We're just going to make sure everything's merged together. So I'm running the machine tools cleanup feature. And then on top of that, I'm going to go ahead and mark this as sharp. So hard ops will do all this, okay? So anything that's a sharp edge will get a seam, basically. You need to make sure when you're doing high to low poly bakes, you're going to use a cage at some point. Your sharp edges get seams, okay? They have to. So Shift G, select one of these sharp edges here, Shift G, select by sharpness, it selects all those, Control E, and then go ahead and mark a seam. So not all seams need to be marked sharp, just going to mention that. And we need to lay this thing out in a predictable manner. I don't know how it's going to unfold here if I do a seam here, but I'm going to go ahead and just press Control E, mark seam there. I got an old add-on that's no longer available, so that's what that pie menu was. Everybody asked about that thing. But let's see. This is looking okayish. Maybe it'll unwrap correctly. We'll find out in a second. It's better to avoid having like excess seams as well sometimes. So if you can get rid of those, get rid of those. Another question I get asked a lot is like, where do you place seams? And so usually, generally speaking, I'm going to make another video about this, but it goes on the center of a bevel. It might go on the side of a chamfer, but you want to place them in places when you're creating LODs or level of detail meshes for games, where when you do the reduction, it doesn't get or blown away basically during the reduction process. So that's usually where seams go, but also in cracks and crevices. Sometimes it might go across indiscriminate areas depending on what you're working on, but usually if you can get them tucked away into crevices, it works out best, or placed on center lines on the bevels. Chamfers, in the case of chamfers, it just goes on one side or the other. It would be the glancing angle, something like that. So in this case, we're not going to focus on that though. So let's go to the UV editor. Press U, unwrap. Let's see what happens here. You see it comes in kind of weird. Okay. There's different methods of unwrapping. This is angle based. If we use conformal, it might come out a little bit cleaner. You can see it's still a little bit sketchy in there. So let's try and see if we can't do something in here. This area really isn't too important. So like you could just kind of unwrap however you see fit to get that to stop occurring basically. It's really getting wild over here though. And I think that's because there might be a seam missing or something. Might be on the outside too. I don't even know which piece that is necessarily. Let's do the, this is the UV sync button, right? Make sure you turn this off when you're not using it. But I'm just curious what's going on here. Like what section is this that's being so bad? Oh, okay. It's up here, you see. And that is a little bit of a problem. And this is why you want to make sure you go through and you check your mesh and you get it as clean as possible, basically. Make sure it's a good, proper model. So you don't end up doing things like this right here. So I'm just going to mark those as seams. No guarantee that's going to work out at all, actually. I'm going to mark that as a seam as well. So we're doing a bunch of seams we shouldn't be right now. That's definitely bad UV mapping. Let's just unwrap it though and see if that straightens all that out a little bit better. And it does. All right. Let's give it some margin. Once again, when you're doing margins, it's like 32 pixels for a 4K texture. It's 16 for 2048, so on and so forth. Down the line we go. We can disable UV sync. We're not going to use that now. All right, so we just needed something unwrapped that's relatively unwrapped correctly, so we can do some baking. And that's the idea of this, is we just want to bake that high to that low. So we'll do upper low, name them this way, so we can use the text tools add-on. So it also work in Substance with those two in particular. But we will need a cage, so we will have to triangulate our base mesh here. Actually, the low poly is always going to be kind of interesting because it needs to be something like, if you're using sharps, you're going to use shade auto smooth, and you're going to do your weighted normals, keep sharp. You might use the face influence, and then you'll go through and do a triangulate. Okay, and usually you got to triangulate whenever you go into different software. But even here in Blender, we're going to triangulate this one. Okay, so now that we got the load on, we can duplicate it. And what we're going to do is we're going to apply all that. We're just going to convert it to a mesh real quick. And we're going to turn this into a cage. You apply that triangulate to your cage because we want to Alt-S this out to create the cage. You can see what it's kind of doing here. If we don't apply the triangulation changes. It changes the vertex orders. It creates errors here in Blender, but it also creates errors in other software potentially as well. And so Alt-S will pull it out a bit. I'm going to offset it even. So you can use that offset even button. Sometimes it works out better, sometimes it doesn't. Now I need to make sure this is encompassing both the high poly and the low poly. So I'm going to go ahead and create a material for it real quick. And we're going to set this up under viewport display. We're going to change this to a blue. And we're going to turn this blue alpha down. Okay, now this is for the viewport display section. You could set this up for material preview too up here using base colors and setting it to blend mode alpha transparency, and then you're changing the alpha amount, right? So that's just what you do if you're doing material preview. But we can look at this thing now, kind of float around it and take a look and see what's going on here with it basically. If you go Control Alt and Space Bar, you can go full screen, or you can do Control Space Bar. Either one. So we just need to make sure they're both encompassed in this mesh, right? Fully, and that would be the ideal situation. Sometimes you have overlaps. This might actually generate errors, and so you might actually have to go around and tweak things around, and this might be one of those cases where we probably should do that, because you can see that error is going to get a little bit squirrely, but we're going to leave it there so you can see the error, and then we'll get back to it anyways. If we might try to undo the error. All right, anyways, I think we're good with this. So let's go ahead and go to UV editing. We don't need to be in edit mode to do this. We have the cage, we have the high, we have the low. Text tools add-on, we'll be using bake. By default, it's got kind of up correctly here. What we're looking for is that we have the low poly represented with the cube, the high, and then the cage. Make sure they're working basically. If you don't see this update, like if you change something, you have to hover over the UV editor real quick to get it to update. All right, so with that out of the way, let's do a 1024. We will bake with 2 times anti-aliasing. Talked about this in another video. Just anti-aliasing in Blender is upsampling, or it bakes at twice the resolution and it downsamples. So it's going to do a 2048 and downsample it to a 1024. Using 4x here with text tools doesn't really make a big difference, to be honest. Just use the 2x. Also, we might need to set ray distance, so we bump that up a little bit. So that way the rays don't cast infinitely out in all directions. All right, and so that should be good to go now. I think we'll be okay to just click bake, and we'll see what happens here with this thing. And it should just take just a second, and we have a bake out like so. Okay, so when you see these little yellow markers, usually this means it's a ray miss of some sort, or there's some kind of error there. Something like that's going on. In our case, these are part of the rail, and we might have just mesh folding over on itself with the cage. So that cage could be shooting kind of ray misses basically, because it might be like folded in like the bottom down there was, and it just might not be doing quite what we want. Okay, so we might have to tweak the cage here a little bit. Now, I don't think ray distance will help that much, but we'll try ray distance first. We'll bump it up more to see if some of those go away. It may not, who knows? But we'll find out here in a second. And it's getting worse, actually, so maybe it's too much ray distance. Who knows? We'll try bumping it down then and baking it again. This is why you want to do preview bakes. Don't use like the highest resolution possible. It's just going to help you out to do it a little bit less. All right, so it looks like it's fixing it by bumping those down. We'll play around with shifting the cage here in just a second, but you'll see like some of this stuff doesn't look too good. I don't know exactly what's causing that, but we would want to inspect our mesh basically with the bake on it. So let's do that. Let's just go to layout again real quick. We're going to take the low, duplicate it. So Shift D, hit X, bring it out to the side, create a material for it. In this one, we can go to the shading editor for it. All we're going to do is create texture. So Shift A, texture, image texture, Shift A, vector, normal map, plug it in, color to color, normal to normal. All right, and now we can see we can load up that bake. We're going to set the metallic property up, okay, so we can see it a little bit better. Now your normal maps, of course, usually are set to non-color. It does it by default here, but you'll want to go ahead and do that. And also, if you plan on using this thing later on, the texture itself, just remember, you have to save these out, save as, and save it wherever you got to save it. Save it as a 16-bit image, not 8-bit, okay? PNG, 16-bit. Best bet with that, okay? Now, let's go ahead and go Z, layout, Z, material preview. We'll turn the wireframes off a second. Let's take a look at this thing. It's baked out mostly correctly. It's got a little bit of weirdness happening here. That's definitely the cage shooting something of a ray miss almost, I think. So we can tweak that maybe. We'll play with that here in a second. And you'll see here where we had that other issue. I probably is still having issues, and it is. Okay. Also, we got some weirdness going on here. Surprisingly, some stuff like this will happen in Blender. You just can't avoid it with the baker and Blender. I don't know exactly why this might happen or occur, but sometimes it does. Blender's not the best baker, so do use other software if possible. In our case, we might be having rays casting through certain areas and just weird stuff going on. So there's supposed to be like a ray limit method that I don't think Blender even has in it. So something like that's going on, like an ignore backface thing. But yeah, so for the most part, it's okay. I'm not gonna say it's great, but it's okay. We could try tightening up the cage as well. That might help us out a little bit. So let's go to solid preview, go back over here. You don't want to do these things too large, but you don't want to do them too small. You want to try to just nudge them together, basically. It's not necessarily as close as it possibly can go. That'll cause problems as well. But you can see what's going on here. Also, you might want to try doing this without using, oh, you see this? This is nice. So like if your mesh is kind of, your low poly mesh, because basically your cage is your low poly mesh, sometimes it might just move in really weird, odd directions if you don't necessarily have it made quite as well as it should be. You might have to shift things kind of back into place. That's a possibility. You do have some leeway on these cages, and that might be one of the reasons we had issues on the front section there as well in this area. Some weird stuff like that might have been going on. Oh, but really bad triangulation. Okay, so that's one of them right there. You want to watch out for things like this. This is why you do want to clean up your meshes as well as you can anyways. But you can see here, this one decided to shoot out in that direction. Who knows why, but it did. And that's what it did. That's its vertex normal. It usually is going along, so that's probably what happened there. All right, so we'll push it back. We might have to scale it on X. We have both of those selected on the other side as well, so we might scale them in a little bit even. And what this is doing, of course, I explained in the previous video, is that it is shooting a ray from this vertex to the low poly, and then it's intersecting with the high poly at certain points. So basically, it's doing this number where this cage is going to the low. That's why they need the vertex numbers. And then wherever it hits a high poly at, it's going to copy that normal data over, basically. Believe it or not, the low poly and the high poly, both of their normals are recorded into the normal map. So if you were to change the low poly later on, which a lot of times you will, so you can have like an optimized low poly. Usually when you bake a low poly, it's unoptimized. It's maybe not this messy like this, but it'll be still technically unoptimized model. You might add additional edges to prevent skewing and things like that. So what ends up happening though is that those ray directions can be very important, especially when you're working on things like cylinders. When you get like that saw pattern on it, or like it's like an in and out kind of pattern to the normal map, you can change those things with the cage and fix them. But you'll have to. I'm going to make a video on that one, but it's not this one. Okay, we might get some errors here still if we were to rebake this, but we'll go ahead and try to do it real quick and just see if this works out for the most part. If it does, besides that really bad triangulation on the cylindrical piece there, we should be okay. Well, that's pretty good. Oh, we can do these top ones too. I forgot about those ones. Maybe you see like some of this is getting a little iffy in here. Bad triangulation for sure. So you do want to clean your models up, guys. Right, so we're still getting like some weird stuff going on in here. But for the most part, I mean, it's pretty decent. I think a lot of you guys can see the future of this model if we had taken the time to clean it up a bit more. It would have worked out very well for the most part, this baking setup anyways. So I want to do one more thing. Let's go ahead and go back to the cage. And let's go ahead and try to fix these top ones, which are ray missing. So these are ray missing. I can only assume because this whole edge is shooting, let's see. Yeah, so this is too high, basically, by the looks of it. All of this is too high. And it's, well, what it's doing is it's shooting a ray kind of down in this direction, but it's skewed over here somehow. I think it's this fault here. This is causing the issue. So I'm going to pull that back down so it's a little bit tighter. And we'll try to avoid shooting a Remesh in there, hopefully. And you could try doing things like that too, maybe, but I don't know if that's going to fix it. We're going to find out here. We're going to do it real quick. So we'll see real quick. We'll just bake it again real quick. Select all three of them, let it go. And when it's done. We can go Z material preview, go back. Let's see if we fixed that issue or we did not. Does not appear we have fixed that entirely. Oh, you know what? It looks like I might have not marked that edge sharp either. No, it is marked sharp. Okay, so this is actually interesting. I didn't realize I just did this, but this is usually something you want to avoid, a seam with a seam next to each other really close like this, because you might only get like a couple pixels in this area, if that, and so you'll basically have like almost no texture data rendering there on something like this. So actually pulling these two together would have probably been a better bet than leaving them separated like that. Now, if we tried merging them all like this, and we go back and change the low poly, basically, what ends up happening is we have to redo the cage and go through that whole process again. So I'm going to leave it alone for this video, but you would probably want to merge these before you go off and start baking something like that potentially. Little tiny chamfers like that with seams, definitely not a good idea, I would say. So you can see plenty of errors we've ran into. Hopefully you understand some of these fixes. It's the bottom one here that's causing the problem by the looks of it. So we're going to attempt to see if we can still fix that one more time, and then we'll call this video after that. So it looks like it was the bottom one. Let's see what that thing's doing. And we can grab both of them on the bottom here. Cross, oh, not that edge, this one. Okay. And let's see what's going on now. That bottom one there. So it looks like, first of all, it's not even all the way through, is it? Or did I grab a triangle? The middle of a triangle, I think. It looks like I grabbed part of a triangle or something. You can alt middle click, by the way. This is what I'm doing. Alt middle click around your models. Looks okay. Looks like the right one. Let's see if this was the same one. Looks like the same one. So this is ray casting up this way. You see, like it's ray casting up in that direction. And what it's doing is when it does that, it's the equivalent of it looking up. And you can see when we try to align to that edge, it looks like it's grabbing this in this area, right? That's kind of what that raycast is doing. So if we were to send this out, I think that'll fix that. Let's try pressing S and X and moving it out like that. That's going to skew this area pretty heavily, but let's see what happens. We'll see if that fixes it. I think it will. So cage, high, low, bake. We'll try that one more time. If it doesn't fix it, I'm just going to give up and rage quit this video, but it should be all right, I think. And we'll see. So you can skew the direction of the ray. You can see we almost fixed it. It is better looking, but it's not quite as good as it could be possibly. And so that, but it might cause other little errors in areas. So you don't usually want to skew them too heavily. And we also have the fact that there's two extremely small edges with seams on them, complicating the process here. But yeah, it's definitely better than it was, but you can see it was a pretty extreme edit. So probably wouldn't want to do that. Other little areas like this, obviously, might have their own things going on. This is probably bad triangulation if I had to take a guess. Maybe I didn't unwrap that correctly, and I did not. There's no seam in here, so there's no way that's going to unwrap correctly. That's what that problem is. So it's always good to go look at these things, analyze them, and don't get caught up in this idea that like you're going to do a perfect low poly, a perfect cage, and it's all just going to work the first time you do it. It's a back and forth thing. You got to get used to doing it. You know, look for errors, try to fix the errors, try to figure them out. Just remember, you need a cage. You need to mark all your edges that are sharp. You need to mark them as seams, and you need to use a cage. Use the weighted normals or whatever to get the shading correct. But that cage is going to be able to be modified to correct issues, any remaining issues potentially with the bake itself. The only thing I want to mention, I said this previously, Your islands need to be mostly up and down, left and right. If you took like a sharp or like a straight edge and you had it canted a little to the right, that would create aliasing effects on the edge. It wouldn't be a good bake either. So just keep that in mind. Sometimes it's unavoidable to have aliasing on edges. The solution for that, for the most part, is just using a higher resolution image and maybe more anti-aliasing, and that's about all you can do for those. Some edges you just cannot absolutely straighten out up and down, left and right. So just keep that in mind. And ultimately, I think you'll have more success with this as you do it more. Like the first time you do it, you're going to be confused. It's going to be frustrating. Just do it more and practice it. It's something that, just like modeling, you have to get used to, when you run into situations, how you deal with them. So that's what this is about. But you can see how the remesh workflow fits into this, because I haven't really demoed this before. You can absolutely remesh certain models very quickly. If you create a nice low poly model, you can work this out super fast, guys. High poly modeling is not what it once was. You don't always have to use subdivision. I know a lot of people still go on and on about creating good subdivision models. Now, personally, I like using subdivision still, but I'll do a whole baking video using subdivision. I won't do it in this one, but that'll be coming up on the channel. So for right now, though, this is the remesh kind of bake workflow, right? Hope you enjoyed. I'll check you out in the next one. All right, take care.